Well, a growing number of people in this province are living on the streets, and so the need for a place to warm up or spend the night continues to grow. And right now, there aren't enough places for people to go. Cities across the province are trying to set up more shelter spaces. Salvation Army's Gordon Taylor says more beds are needed.
Ultimately, the long-term solution is to have more available, adequate housing so people don't need shelters at all. But we're currently in a situation, and for the foreseeable future, when we do need shelter beds to supplement the housing that is being built. And so it's obvious from this winter that there are not enough shelter beds in town.
So now the question is, where is the best place for a shelter to be located? Today we'll hear from city councillors in both Regina and Saskatoon, and a registered social worker who's also a frontline worker on the streets of Regina. We also want to hear from you. You can call us on this one, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. David Curtin is councillor for Ward 3 in Saskatoon, and his ward is home to the Fairhaven shelter, which is continuing to see criticism from people in the neighborhood. Organizations, though, say the need for shelter space continues to grow. Yet, plans were axed for an emergency shelter in the Sutherland neighborhood on the other side of town. So, where is the best place in Saskatoon for a shelter? I spoke with Councillor Curtin earlier.
Good afternoon, Alicia.
For people outside of Saskatoon, can you give us an overview? What is the conversation that's taking place right now regarding emergency shelter space in Saskatoon?
Well, I think it might be even fair to say that there might be a growing divide, but also commonalities, if we want to talk about sides in this issue. Fairhaven Shelter came to be about a year and a half, a little more than a year and a half ago, when the province bought a church in the Fairhaven neighborhood, and then contracted the Saskatoon Tribal Council to operate an emergency shelter, a wellness center there with 106 beds. For the last year and change, I've been saying that the number of beds in that shelter is probably too large to be sustainable in that neighborhood. There's been an effect in the neighborhood. There's absolutely no doubt about that, and there needs to be some changes. But there is also a growing call, if you will, from some people, not myself, to have this center closed down or to have a new service provider. And my question to anybody who wants to close this center down would be, where do these people go then? We actually had people from Fairhaven who were rallying against the effort to establish a shelter in the Sutherland neighborhood, which is on the exact opposite end of Saskatoon, on the east side of Saskatoon, whereas Fairhaven's on the extreme west side. And for some Fairhaven residents to go and rally against a shelter in Sutherland, and then complain that the shelter is causing grief in Fairhaven, it doesn't make any sense to me. We need more shelters. We need at least maybe 3 more shelters if we reduce the number of beds in the Fairhaven shelter, and the city right now is working on locations to give to the province and see if those locations will fit the province's criteria, and hopefully we'll be able to find these locations. But Alicia, it's going to be more difficult because last week, or the week before, pardon me, when the motion was brought forward for a distance criteria of 250 meters from any school, that has severely limited where shelters could go in Saskatoon, and it's going to be tough, and it's going to take time, and time is not what we have.
It does have a lot of people asking, where is the best location for something like this? Should it be downtown? Which neighborhoods? Where in the city? What are your thoughts on the best placement for an emergency shelter like this?
I'm going to disagree with some people who believe it should be in the core areas where there are family, friends, and services. I believe it should be distributed throughout Saskatoon. I've seen people who are vulnerable to being homeless or unhoused in just about every neighborhood in Saskatoon. We have seen encampments. I can't remember exactly right now. I think we've got some 65 neighborhoods in Saskatoon, and we've seen encampments in 55 of those, something like that. Most neighborhoods have seen encampments anyway. And so we need to distribute to the shelters, I believe, throughout the city of Saskatoon. They don't, as far as I'm concerned, need to be in light industrial areas. These are the Sutherland shelter was going to be a 30-bed shelter with no complex needs people. We're going to have another facility on Idlewild Drive in Saskatoon for those with complex needs. So this was going to be a shelter for 30 beds. I think it's very sustainable in a neighborhood. And I think if we could spot those around Saskatoon, we'd be good.
What have you learned, though, from the experience with the Fairhaven shelter? What concerns have you heard from citizens that you think are important to pay attention to and to learn from?
First thing I think I've learned is that placing a shelter on an election year is tough because people are going to capitulate to what to the concerns that we heard in Sutherland. There were concerns about ACT Arena. Now, ACT Arena, for those not in Saskatoon, is a community arena for figure skating and for hockey. A lot of kids go there, and the shelter would have been very close to that arena. But there isn't a kid who goes to that arena without a parent. So I didn't really get the secure, quote unquote, security concerns with that. We are not going to find areas where there isn't going to be opposition, and we just have to live with that.
You're talking about Sutherland, the one on
Yes.
the east side of Saskatoon, but the Fairhaven residents and some of the concerns that have come forward with that shelter being there for a year and a half now. Has it changed that neighborhood?
Yes. Yes, it has. There's no doubt about it. And I've had anecdotal evidence from people who have talked to me and emailed me. We have to remember, though, that until last October, that Fairhaven shelter was allowing people with complex needs, or worse, turning them away, the people with complex needs, without a plan. And of course, those people would be the vulnerable people would be hanging out in the neighborhood, and causing challenges in businesses. There's a dance studio that's close to closing because there are a lot of parents who don't want to take their kids there anymore, that sort of thing. But as of October, Saskatoon Tribal Council determined that there would be no complex needs people allowed in there anymore. And I believe that the situation around that shelter has changed a little bit. Doesn't mean that it's all rosy. I don't think there's going to be a shelter in any neighborhood that goes in there that doesn't affect a neighborhood in some way. What we have to do as a city is try to be as proactive as possible with our policing and with other departments to ensure that effect is minimal.
You mentioned that it's difficult to find a shelter space when we're heading into an election. There will be an election in November. You just announced that you will not be running again, which puts you in a different position than those who might be seeking re-election. Did that factor into your decision not to run again? You know, some of these really complex, often controversial problems that lead to heated discussions, and you're not, at the end of the day, sometimes you're not making anyone happy. Did that factor into your decision not to run again?
It had a little bit to do with that, absolutely. Overall, it's a tiring experience. These people who are my colleagues on council are amazing people who have this ability to be able to deal with a changing environment out there, a changing political environment, a changing way in which people treat politicians. And they are amazing people on city council. I would go to sleep thinking about Fairhaven and wake up thinking about Fairhaven, and throughout the day thinking about Fairhaven. And it's quite a drag on you physically, emotionally as well. There have been times, especially with Fairhaven, because the city had no say in this matter. The province bought the church, contracted STC. There was no zoning changes that were needed, so there was no public hearing. And now the action is between the tribal council and the province. The negotiations are on between the province and the tribal council. And again, the city has no say. So it's been frustrating that way. You feel like your back is against the wall and all you can do is watch what's happening sometimes. And all you can do is try to get as much policing as possible in the area and clean up as possible in the area. But I'm reacting instead of being proactive.
So you have a few months left before it's at the end of your time as counselor. I want to thank you for the time that you've put in as a counselor
Thank you.
so far. But in these last few weeks and months, how do you hope this ends up? I mean, what would be the outcome that you'd like to see after all of these conversations?
Yeah, 246 days, by the way. You know what? My goal, my dream would be that there would be some funding come out of somewhere, provincial government, federal government, so that we could find more housing. This is we keep talking shelters. What we really need to be talking about is housing, transitional housing, supportive housing, affordable housing. Federal government is coming out with the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is going to force cities like ours to make some very significant zoning changes, which is also going to allow for a more affordable housing faster. That's the answer to all of this: is ways in which we can open up and transitional, supportive, and affordable housing in Saskatoon, and then. God, the dream would be that there would not be a need for shelters. I know that that's never going to be a reality, but at the same time, we really need to keep thinking about housing more than anything else. Short term, I'm really hoping that the administration is able to come up with a few locations for the province to take a look at, and that we do get some shelters before we get anywhere near next winter. We have a warming location in Saskatoon at a church on 20th Street called St. Mary's, and it was designed basically for 80 people, and over the past number of weeks it has been 140 people, 150 people in that warming location every night, and then they have to be herded out in the morning for the rest of the day. That means that we still have a growing problem with those who are unhoused in Saskatoon, and we need to find more areas and more places and more beds for them.
Councillor Curtin, I thank you for your time today.
Take care, Alicia.
David Curtin is councillor for Ward 3 in Saskatoon. He will not be seeking re-election. Robert Pierce is a local pastor in Saskatoon who has said he intends to run for the Ward 3 council seat, and he is someone who's been outspoken against the shelter in Fairhaven. We got a message from Mark, who reached out to us, who says he thinks instead of fighting against shelters, churches should be opening their doors as sanctuaries for people who need shelter. What are your thoughts? You can join the conversation today, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Let's go to Regina now. Andrew Stevens is a Ward 3 city councillor there. His area covers Cathedral, North Central, and downtown. He's attended many public consultations over the years with people who are concerned about shelters in their neighborhoods. He is in a meeting right now, so our producer Nicole Huck caught up with him last night, and she started by asking him what his constituents have been saying about shelters in their neighborhoods.
I'd say across the board, the major concern in this overall conversation is how do we deal with the serious issue of homelessness and all the surrounding and root cause issues that lead to it. I think there's a consensus on that being an important issue, and we need to tackle it. People come from all different perspectives. Some people just don't want it in their neighborhood, and rightfully so. People are offended by the fact that society as rich as ours allows this to happen. Where the divide starts to emerge is the solution. And again, I think people would agree that we need to commit resources to housing people, and depending on the circumstances, providing the adequate supports to help them get on their feet, deal with whatever issues are causing houselessness, whether it's mental health, whether it's addictions, you name it. But where does that happen? And that's where things get a little tricky. And it really depends on the neighborhood. So, I've been fortunate enough to represent neighborhoods where there's a great deal of satisfaction with seeing different levels of government tackle this issue. And many residents are supportive of seeing organizations like the Y popping up nearby and helping to solve the problem in the short and the long term. Others, however, I think the immediate response is this is necessarily going to result in the decline in property values. There's going to be more crime in the neighborhood. There's going to be a general sense of unwellness, and our children are at risk. And I think some of those fears, for businesses that have to deal with clients that are coming in that might be disruptive, it might be a legitimate concern. I think in most cases it's unfounded, and I think a lot of the one-off incidents are exaggerated, and it becomes therefore all shelters are, equally problematic. And in some cases, residents don't realize that there have been shelters of some kind in their neighborhood for years, if not decades, and they didn't even know about it. So it provokes a lot of concern, and I think residents are very divided on how we deal with it and where those solutions should be housed. But there is an overall concern and consensus that we need to take this seriously and deal with it.
So there was recently a meeting in Cathedral of people who were concerned about crime in that neighborhood. What was you were at that meeting. What was your takeaway from that meeting?
Well, I think it was a pretty solid representation of the neighborhood and the kind of issues. My takeaway is, and this is really interesting, which is whenever people get together to talk about crime, it very quickly talks about, or the discussion is all about the social issues. So crime, someone breaking into my yard, someone breaking into my home, that's a crime. Someone stealing my property from my backyard. Very quickly, I think the reality is we know that there's serious social and economic problems that are provoking that. And we'll very quickly talk about addictions. I think what was very heartwarming is the fact that there's a lot of residents and business owners that are like, look, we don't want to call the cops on these individuals, but for various reasons, either we're not trained to deal with someone who's in crisis. Who do we call for that? And so I think that's a very sound response. And, an employer should legitimately be concerned about an employee, especially in the, let's take the service industry. They're low paid. They're trying to serve food and coffee, and they're not equipped to deal with someone who's in crisis or someone who is using intravenous drugs in the washroom. And they have a legitimate concern, and I think they should be calling upon different levels of government to help address that. And that's what I saw at that town hall. And then I think this is a minority, the folks who were there. There were some that were just agitated that we would even think about having a place like the old YM in the downtown, even close to a residential neighborhood. And some of their concerns are purely economic. I'm losing business, and I'm certain that it has to do with this facility, and I don't care where you put it, just put it somewhere else. The only thing that matters to me is my bottom line. Those people exist. I don't think at all they are in the majority. And in fact, I heard business owners say, we just need to deal with these root causes. We can't be handling it in our establishment. What are we going to do about it? And they were presenting solutions. So I think it was a really good engagement, and some people have a very different view, and it's all about their bottom line. But I think for the most part, residents, business owners, and others just want to find a sustainable solution that helps deal with this. And they don't want their kids tripping over and finding needles in the community. And that's a perfectly legitimate concern I have as a parent as well.
Where do you think is the appropriate place for a shelter?
I don't know. I mean, the appropriate place for people to live is in a residential neighborhood, right? So what is a shelter?
Supportive housing?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right? So if you have people living somewhere, by nature of how we zone, that means it's appropriate to have it in a residential neighborhood. If I think about the YWCA and the facility it's building, that's going to be one of the most incredible community hubs in Cathedral, probably the city, one of the nicest buildings. People are going to live there. Every member of the public is going to be welcome to go in there and use that common space. I think it's going to be a great facility. Where else would you put apartments, and where else would you put those kind of services? I think it's really going to contribute to the neighborhood and to a community. I think the concern comes with folks who are hard to house. They might have serious issues that spill out in the community. And I think the fear is that that shelter and that space isn't supportive enough. And I think what you have to differentiate is, are the folks that are homeless and sleeping in vestibules at all attached to that particular shelter? Or is it the question of we don't actually have enough spaces for those people to live? And quite frankly, they're in the neighborhood because they have nowhere else to go, or this might be the safest community for them to sleep at night, even if it's sleeping rough. And I think that the solution to that is having more spaces for them. So I think what we need to do is have a conversation about what is a shelter, what kind of services are offered there, what is the size and what is the scale. But I can tell you where they don't belong, and that is just sequestered in the city in some abandoned industrial zone. I think that's not appropriate, and I don't think that really helps solve any of these problems.
I mean, you alluded to this earlier, that we've had shelters and supportive housing in Regina for decades. Do you feel like the conversation has shifted lately? And if so, like, what has changed?
I'd say overall the scale of the problem has just skyrocketed. And it's not a Regina issue. This is even bigger in large metropolitan centers like Toronto and Vancouver and major urban centers as well in the United States. I think just generally speaking, there's more chronic houselessness. If we're looking at the point in time count, there's more people that we would classify as homeless. And it's not because of a wildfire that forces them south during fire season. It's people who are suffering with real serious socioeconomic challenges and issues that are forced to sleep rough. That's, I would say, getting out of control to a point it's a crisis. Why we're surprised at it is just astounding. When I got elected in 2016, I saw this train coming like most people. Like, the fact that we're surprised by it is shocking, but I think the scale of it is so much. And so when the nest pops up in the downtown, well, that was preceded by a pretty sharp increase in the types of problems that are associated with homelessness. And so I think the nest emerges as a response to what people are seeing. I don't think it's fair to say it's a cause. And so I think we're just seeing more of it on a day-to-day basis in neighborhoods where it was maybe one person here or there that might be seen as a problem in that streetscape or that community. Now it's all over. And it's not just the Cathedral neighborhood. And that's the issue. The problem across the board is getting worse. And we're seeing the most visible representation of it. Addictions exist all over the city. If you look at heat maps in terms of where the police and fire are responding to, it's everywhere. It happens to be concentrated in neighborhoods like Cathedral, like North Central and Heritage. And it's getting out of control. It's a crisis and it has to be dealt with. And I think people in the public are saying, well, what is the solution, elected official? Are you working with other levels of government to handle this? Sure, we can have needle pickups, but what do we do to prevent people from having to use intravenous drugs in our parks, outside of schools if that's happening, or in bus stops? We're seeing more of it. We're seeing the crisis. And I think people just weren't paying attention, and a lot of people just weren't seeing it coming. And I think there's a lot of organizations that were predicting this. I think my concern in terms of what I've seen in Saskatoon is they created by my perception, an arbitrary distance and a buffer zone from schools. And I think what we have to have is a real conversation that involves community members as well as folks who are running these facilities to get an idea of where is the appropriate place, why is that the appropriate place, and let's go through the facts about, is there crime that necessarily emerges when a shelter surfaces in a community, or is that problem already there and is the shelter a response to what we're seeing on the streets? I worry right now is that people will get frustrated. They'll think that the supportive approach, the harm reduction approach, the supportive housing approach has failed, even though it really hasn't gone off the ground. And they're going to turn to a law and order campaign. And I'm seeing more of that, and that frightens me. In other words, we will see people asking increasingly, and I think the federal conservative leader is fueling this, we just need to lock these people up, even if they haven't committed crimes. Rather than dealing with the problems at their base, we're just going to law and order our way through this, and it will solve nothing. It will make matters worse. My big fear is people will just get frustrated and turn to the easy answer, which even the police are saying won't work. That is a fear that I have. That part is amplifying.
Andrew Stevens is a city councillor for Regina's Ward 3 neighborhood that covers North Central, downtown, and Cathedral. He was speaking with Blue Sky producer Nicole Huck. We'd like to hear your thoughts on this. 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Rob Krauser is a registered social worker who's also a frontline worker on the streets of Regina. He's been attending all the local meetings with people who are concerned about crime, safety, and shelters, but he also sees firsthand exactly what needs there are in Regina. And he joins us right now from our Regina studio. Rob, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. You've been listening to the show so far. What are your thoughts on what you've been hearing?
I agree with a lot of things that were said by David and by Andrew. Since I talk with Andrew and we're from the same city, I see a lot of the things that he says I see firsthand. So I see what he's talking about, and his concerns are very valid about the law and order aspect coming to light, and we've seen that starting to play out with the pipes getting taken away for harm reduction, things like that. So I do feel that's coming, and I'm dreading that because that is the furthest thing from what's needed right now. But
You've been to some community meetings, and so what are you hearing directly from people who have expressed some concerns? What do they share with you?
well, just from listening, I usually try not to talk until the end, but of the meetings. But I like to just know what people are saying. But mostly, it's not to be for me to come in and try and change their mind or anything. It's more of like, okay, I see that that's the issue you're having. So how can the work that I'm doing and the team I'm working with, how can we help with that? So a lot of it's education based. A lot of people don't know how to deal with somebody intoxicated or somebody on drugs. And I understand too that there's lots of workers that just don't feel comfortable when dealing with that. So, and that's fine. Not everybody has to. I work in it, so I do feel comfortable with it. So I know their concerns. A lot of them are very valid. Like the one with the new complex needs one, though, it's a secured facility, so it isn't actually a shelter.
Yeah, can you tell us more about the difference? Because I think shelter ends up being this blanket term for all sorts of different housing situations. Explain to people what would a facility do, or what would it look like if it were to serve people with complex needs?
So the need I've been debating on how to say this without I don't want to seem like I'm knocking this whole idea, but the language that was used, and language is very important, and the language that was used, complex needs emergency shelter, that kind of lets people think that it's going to be a shelter where people come and go from, and you're going to be having people with mental illness, addictions just all over the place. But that's not what it is at all. So it's 15 beds. You can only be brought there by the police, so the person has to have an interaction with the police to be taken there. So no outside organizations are allowed to bring anybody there with complex needs, which was why I went to the meeting in the first place, to find out who was running it, so I knew who to talk to help get people off the street that needed help.
Who is running it? I'm curious.
So it's Government of Saskatchewan. Justice is involved. I'm assuming SHA because they're going to have nurses and stuff on staff. But Edgewood is the main contract, I think, which is the same one as the treatment center that's being opened in Lumsden.
Do you foresee any issues with a facility like that being in a neighborhood if they're being escorted there? Mm-hmm. Do you think, I think a lot of people get concerned if people are camping outside of places, right?
Yeah.
And the coming and going. So do you foresee what kind of issues might come up with something like this?
The issue that struck me the most is they said that they give people transportation when they're done after let's say they last a full 24 hours or are held there. So they give them transportation to a community organization that already is battling underfunding and no access to resources because there just isn't shelter space. So if that person's coming off of being homeless and was intoxicated and found on the street, where are they going to go that night? Like, it's going to be the same. It's just going to play over and over again. There might be the odd person that takes the help that's offered, but in 24 hours, that's pretty short time to build a relationship. And I'm not sure if I'm hoping they have a fast track system with the Edgewood Treatment Center in Lumsden, and that's how they're going to do it. And they can send somebody out and detox them there and start treatment. If that's what they're doing, then that kind of makes sense. But I feel that the numbers and the price point value on it is just not going to line up. But it's tough because they're not actually dealing with complex needs, if I'm being honest. They're dealing with intoxicated people that are willing to go voluntarily once they have an interaction with the police. So they're arrested or whatever. And if they don't have any outstanding warrants or anything, then they can go. And if they're non-combative. So basically, those are the people that Regina Detox takes right now, is the ones. And when the police get called to detox to remove them, it's because they're combative, like to the point where staff can't handle it. And they can handle a lot.
I want to bring in a community member, but I just have one last question. Well, not a final question, but one question before we get to our next guest. What do you see as the need for this? I'd like to give you just a moment to express how important you think this space will be.
From a policing standpoint, maybe it's needed because maybe they're running out of rooms in their drunk tanks, stuff like that. And the non-combative people, they feel can go somewhere else. But from a shelter perspective and from an actual houselessness initiative, it doesn't deal with it. Like the percentage would be like extremely low of what difference it will make.
Okay.
It's just not. I hope good things for it, and I hope it does help some people. But I'm just curious as to what organizations they're willing to work with locally, because we've been trying to work with these people and help them, but there's nothing for them. So I'm just looking forward to seeing what happens, but also a little frightened, if that makes sense, for the people, not for the government. But.
Rob, don't go anywhere. I want you to stay with us, but I would like to bring in someone else to the conversation. So Alex Tack is one of the people who went to a public meeting that took place earlier this week about the new proposed complex needs emergency shelter in Regina. Pioneer Manor is being proposed as a temporary pilot site for the shelter. Representatives from the province and Regina Police attended the meeting. And so Alex Tack is the chairperson for the Rosemont Mount Royal Community Association. Alex, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being with us. I'm wondering what the questions you've had, the concerns that you yourself and your community that you represent. What you went into this meeting? What were you concerned about?
A lot of our concerns early on, is kind of twofold. One would be the transparency piece, right? Is that I find far too often when it comes to dealing with the province and the city of Regina, they'll do a 300-meter bailout, but they have full awareness of what community organizations exist within those areas, and we shouldn't be the last ones to find out when things are happening, so we can be part of that conversation, not to hinder, but to help and to provide feedback, information, guidance. Now, this is happening more in the McNabb community, but Doonie is right there, and as soon as you cross Doonie, you're into Rosemont Mount Royal, and specifically in Rosemont, where we do have a lot of socioeconomic problems, addictions, transient activities, all sorts of things. So that was one piece that had some concerns there. Is just really wanted to highlight the importance of looping in everybody and not just doing 300 meters and kind of wiping your hands of it.
But once you're looped in, I'll let you continue.
No.
But once you're part of the conversation, what are the questions that you've got?
Well, the big question that we had is, what other resources are going to be available to help these folks? So again, listening to the conversations that have already been happening, a lot of the organizations that would help people find a pathway to success, whatever that looks like for them in those next steps, they're already at capacity, underfunded. There's just not enough of these resources. And when you look at West Regina, we're bereft of any resources. We've been literally fighting with the city of Regina for multi-purpose space to be able to help our residents in a variety of ways, and we're just being told to use churches, and that is their final answer. There's no libraries in our area. There's no spaces to hold any kind of mental health resources or addictions resources. We don't even have places to consistently hold meetings to be able to help support our residents. So, and that's not just us. This is the entire West Regina. So I can't help but feel that, there's a lot more that can be done at the same time. And there's a lot of missing resources, this just being one small piece of a larger answer.
If you had additional resources, would this be the right spot for this kind of shelter? Where do you think this kind of shelter belongs in Regina?
Well, it's tough because to the point that folks have been making so far is that once they're done and they've left the building, they have an option to attach a ride to go to a place or two resources that may be able to help them. I I don't want to say, hey, put it in places that have these resources, because it's really tough conversation, because people need help of all types. But again, it just comes back to there just isn't anything in West Regina to help them support. Like we looked at doing community fridges. There's no place to put a community fridge in our area. We've looked at doing clothing drop-offs, things like that. There's nothing, like, we just do not have those supports, no matter how much we want to help. And I can't help but feel be better suited around locations where there are people and organizations that would be able to assist with this. And if there isn't, then they should be putting that infrastructure in places into the regions, not just putting this 5% stopgap and just saying, yeah, we've done this and that's it.
Is that how you would characterize some of the other folks who have come forward? I think sometimes these issues are oversimplified. It's either yes or no, but from what I'm hearing from you, it's more than that. That in some ways you sound like a community member who's really trying to fight for its community. That you want to see supports available to people. Are other people on the same page as you, or how would you characterize others in the community when it comes to this issue?
We're a quite large community, so I think it's about 4,500 households. So you're going to get a really diverse opinion based on that. So I don't think it's not possible with Rosemont Mount Royal to paint a single stroke brush, because you are going to find folks on all sides of this issue. Thinking about the issues we've tackled as an organization and the partnerships that we have tried to forge with other localized organizations in our area, I'd like to think that they would be more in line for accepting support where support is there. But again, this is such a small piece, it feels, in all the supports that would be required to set folks up for success, that there's just either more has to be done in tandem, or there needs to be more work to support other organizations to really provide that pathway forward, either locally around us or in close regions nearby.
Okay, well, Alex, I appreciate you being part of the conversation today. Thank you.
You betcha. Have a good day.
You too. That's Alex Tack, chairperson for the Rosemont and Mount Royal Community Association. He did attend a public meeting about a pilot site for a new proposed complex needs emergency shelter in Regina. We did ask Regina City Councillor Andrew Stevens about this proposed complex needs centre in Regina, and here's what he had to say.
I was recently at the General Hospital. It looks like a mini police station. There are police coming in and out of there. So that's already happening in residential areas. The police and the hospitals and how we're dealing with these issues, it's already happening. I think what you need and what we all need collectively are the appropriate places for police and other organizations to take individuals who are in crisis like this. These are institutions that are already delivering care, so that makes sense. I'd have to know more about what's going on at that particular facility, but let's just be honest, this is already happening. The problem is it's straining our hospital system, and it's already going into residential neighborhoods, and the facilities there are not ready to deal with the scope of the issues those individuals are struggling with. So I'd say it makes perfect sense to have a facility that's dedicated to those particular needs, rather than concentrating every bit of life's problems into an emergency room and having the triage system and the nurses handle it on the front end. So I think the facility is needed.
It's Councillor Stevens, who says community engagement is necessary whenever a project like this happens. I want to get to some of our callers now. We've got a lot of people waiting to join the conversation. So let's start with James in Saskatoon. Hi, James.
Hey, good afternoon. So, yeah, I guess my take on this is that I think it does a disservice to the situation to try and talk about it as though it's homelessness. It is not homelessness. The underlying, or the elephant in the room is drugs and drug dependency, right? And that's the issue, because we have people living in our society that choose not to live in a societal norm, right? So, case in point, I speak of in Fairhaven here. I thought it was rather interesting with your interview a little bit earlier on, and as though to say that anybody who experiences violence or crime, that somehow they're just not understanding enough. And that couldn't be the furthest thing from the truth. This has historically in Saskatoon been a blue-collar neighborhood. They understand what it takes to make it through to the next rung on the ladder. But the reality is that when people are behaving badly, that activity cannot be encouraged. Regardless of the circumstance that got you to that point, the reality is everybody wants to live in a better society. So the cornerstone to this all, and I think there's been this realization, we're not only seeing it here in Saskatoon, we're not only seeing it in Regina, it's not a Saskatchewan issue, it's worldwide. So what's the common trait? The only trait that is common is the drugs.
Yeah, I want to ask Rob about that, because I think you raise an important point, James. Rob, what do you say to that? You know, we are talking about homelessness, but we are talking about so much more than that. And how do you think drugs play a role?
I agree with James on the fact that it's not homelessness that this is actually dealing with. It would be drugs, drug dependency. But I think a lot of people forget about alcohol, which is also a drug, and that's a main factor in what this complex needs one, I think, will deal with. There is root causes. It's trauma. There's lack of community, lack of resources. There's so much trauma out there that people are using drugs and alcohol to get away from and mask and blanket that's usually the root cause of it. Like, I would be saying like high 99%. Some people would disagree, but as someone who counsels and does crisis counseling on the street, I don't know. I haven't run into a single person with addictions or alcohol dependency or addiction that doesn't have trauma. So,
yeah. That leads us to our next caller. So Alan joins us on the line right now in Regina. Hi, Alan.
Hi. Well, it's interesting that we just heard from this gentleman because that's basically my point of view as well. I also have been in the field, and I also agree with the fact that we need to look at the fact is that there's all kinds of problems that precede all of the drugs and the homelessness and so on, and our society in general is in trouble. But what I really object to, what I was really calling in originally about, is that the focus on shelters is a complete dead end, because the shelter does not provide the essential soil for any kind of improvement to happen. It's the last stop on the bad road. You've got to have some things happening before that. So, for example, in BC, they tried a project where they provided homeless people with a lump sum. I believe it was $7,000. It had to be spread out over the whole year, and they wanted to see if they could actually make a difference in their lives. And by golly, a lot of them did. They were able to. A lot of them were thrown out of their homes because of mortgage problems, money distribution problems. We've made it worse with this the way the social services money is being distributed, and basically they lost their footing. Subsidization allowed them to regain their footing, and by golly, they were back in their own homes. And I live in the north central. I'm telling you, there's homes galore everywhere, boarded up. These people are not coming from under bushes. They're coming from homes that have been somehow broken up, and we need to look at that part of it. We need to look at what these people are suffering from in terms of leading them to drugs. They don't just go to drugs for no reason. I mean, you've got to be pushed into drugs and by something, and we need to be looking at that kind of a solution long before we start to deal with building new shelters. I mean, that's the way I feel.
Yeah, Alan, thanks for calling. I think Rob's been nodding along a bit here. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Thanks for those comments. I do. So I do most of my work in North Central, and a lot of it does involve I go into those boarded out houses, find people, and try and connect them to services and take them to places. So I'm in and out of those and around those places all the time. I get what you're saying, but I do disagree with the shelter just being a last stop and there's no movement forward, because for instance, the New Beginnings shelter run through Ritz's, the one in the downtown area, they have been bringing services in, such as a social services worker. I come in as a counselor. There's other people that do. they lead it to transitional housing that they're involved with. There's treatment plans. There's nursing staff that can go in. So there is lots of that. I think the problem is that people don't see that because these are the places where we don't invite the public to come in and look, because you're seeing people at their lowest. So it's very private. Not just anybody goes in. It's a locked door system. People are free to leave, but all of those people are in contact with services. It's just a matter of what can the services do for that person. And there is a lot of accountability that needs to happen with people, where some people do not want help. And that might not be a popular opinion, but it's just sometimes they don't. I have people that I do compassion care with daily, and I wish that they would take some help, but they don't. So, but you can still love them and be kind. So I don't think shelters are a dead-end answer, but I do think that some more funding for the people doing the shelters and for services and organizations and nonprofits trying to help these people is in order, because it's easy enough it's one thing to bring in services and nonprofits to help, but if they have no money and no options to help people with and no housing to send them to or supportive living or anything, then it's just a constant 360. It just goes around and around and around. So
I want to share another email here from Judy, who writes, "We have no choice but to deal with shelters as people's lives are at risk. However, we are dealing with the symptoms caused directly from government policies. For most of the homeless, it is caused by government changing their policy of providing housing for the mentally ill and addicted. They knew exactly what the consequences would be, and that they would end up on the streets. Giving $800 a month to people who are incapable of handling money to find housing, and even those that could, it is impossible to find housing for that. The government has totally abdicated their responsibility. Turn the jails into rehab centers, as addiction is a health issue, not a justice issue. Open up more beds in Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford. Stop all immigration until the housing issue is solved. Bringing in 15,000 into a community already short of housing is a no-brainer. Baby boomers are in need of housing, and governments have known since 1946 what the demand would be. Corporations who are bringing in foreign minimum wage workers need to provide housing for these people. Slashing the disability payments is putting disabled people on the street. Seeing people outdoors in Saskatchewan winters cannot be normalized. We need the government to rescind their policies." That email comes to us from Judy. Rob, I'll give you the last 30 seconds here. And I think it's important to reiterate just all of the different facilities have they're different. The different number of beds, different services that are offered. You know, when we talk about Fairhaven, that shelter in Saskatoon, that's very different than what we're talking about in Regina. But how do you hope this conversation continues so that there can be a way forward and a way to help people who need it most right now?
I personally think and would like to see the upper levels of government, the people that put this complex needs place into action and sign the ink. I would like to see conversations with the nonprofits and with the organizations that are actually working with the people and have established relationships. I would like to see them involved in it, because that's who the people are going to go to. And I see it every day. So until they start collaborating with the actual organizations that are doing stuff on the street and with people, I don't know much will change, to be honest.
Rob, I really appreciate you being with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
That's Rob Krauser, a registered social worker who works as a frontline support worker on the streets of Regina. If we didn't get to you today, you can always call our talkback number, 1-800-661-7540.